Hello, welcome. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in the Foreign Policy Program. We're delighted to host you here today for another series in our In Dialogue discussions. Today, we're pleased to have our distinguished fellow at CSEP with us, Ambassador Dr. Jaimini Bhagwati, who is a distinguished former IFS service member, has served India as ambassador to the European Union, as High Commissioner to the UK, has also a rare quality of being a diplomat that has worked very closely with the economic and financial sectors on deputation to the Ministry of Finance as Joint Secretary, with a PhD in economics from Tufts. One of the few IFS officers, or maybe the only one, that has ever worked among the World Bank staff in the derivatives sector. But we're really here today to make use of Dr. Bhagwati's expertise on the economic issues and how economics and strategy blend in India's position as we see the war in the Ukraine intensify. The last time we had Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon here with us around a week ago, where we discussed the implications on India's foreign policy strategy. But it's becoming apparent as the invasion progresses, as Russia continues to mount its military offensive, as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens leave the country.
And as also several countries, not only Western countries, Japan also, for example, have tightened their sanctions and are using economic instruments to try to deter further Russian advances. To discuss all this, but in particular the economic effects of this crisis in the Ukraine, we'll be discussing, I think, the short-term effects, the medium-term effects for India, the long-term ones we can guess, or the unknowns you had mentioned to me earlier, and a bit also of your Europe, I think, experience, since you've really served there several years, how you see Europe reacting to this and how India figures maybe in Europe's perspective on this crisis. But Dr. Bhagwati, let's start maybe with a few quick points on what we know already. I think you had mentioned to me the negative consequences on India's economy, on oil prices that are rising, stock market effects, inflation has hit, I think, a rather high level over the last few days. So if you could walk us through maybe two or three of these issues of how India has already suffered immediate effects on its economy and developmental path.
As you know very well, we all know that the last 2 years, COVID has made life very difficult for the average person and for countries around the world. Just as we were about to come out of all the negative effects of COVID, I'm now abstracting from the suffering of people who actually contracted COVID. Many died, as we know, but also there were economic effects, particularly in the services sector, whether it is hotels, restaurants, and so on. They all had to shut down many of their services. So we've had negative growth in the first year of COVID, that is 2021. 21-22, we are coming out of it, but it's not quite clear to what extent. And just when we thought, because we are in the month of March, 21-22 is not yet over. It will be over on the 31st of March, 2022. It looks as if the earlier projections of, say, the Reserve Bank of India or any other such body which is watching these numbers very closely may turn out to be somewhat optimistic. Why do I say that? Because earlier it could be 9%, then it came down to 8%. Now we are talking somewhere in the mid 7.5, 7.6, etc. Here I'm talking about the gross domestic product. I'm talking about growth in GDP. Now, this is among the multiple reasons is the worry about where oil prices would go. As you know, India imports oil. It imports roughly about US dollars 150 billion worth of oil. 85% of our requirements are met by imported oil. Mind you, it's not because of the fact that we import oil from Russia. From Russia, we only import about just 1 billion worth of oil. It is the price of oil going up because of this conflict, because of this war in Ukraine. That is what might make our oil import bill to go up quite sharply. To that extent, we are going to be negatively affected because this is a significant part of our economy. Now, what could government do? I'm going to give my prescription for that. The government should not pass on the entire cost to the consumer. Then in that case, the point would be, where would the money come? How will the government shoulder the extra burden of the enhanced price of oil? I would say that it needs to do more in mopping up on the direct taxes, particularly on income tax. You may be surprised to know that only about 1.5 million people, taxpayers, who actually file their income tax returns, only about 1.5 million of those who file income tax returns show income above 1 million. That means 10 lakhs per annum. It is obviously not a correct number. And you might recall from what happened at the time of demonetization that some people went into banks with 5, 10, 15 crores. And I remember the Prime Minister mentioning in a talk which was hosted by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, where he said in as many words that he says, and I hope that your membership will not be trying to help people to fudge their income tax returns. So my long answer to your short question means that we need to do more also on our tax, how much we collect as tax when we look at these kinds of shocks like the oil shock. So, because we've had oil shocks in the past, you remember in the 70s that there was an oil shock, etc. So it's a long time that we have taken to try and insulate ourselves a little bit. Maybe we need to have some buffer stocks and so on.
So that's a long-term diversification strategy. We'll come to that also. But inflation also has skyrocketed here. Is that already related to these to this import dependence?
I think inflation has started to trend up even before this conflict. As you may have noticed in newspapers or in journal articles, that the wholesale price index, the WPI, has gone above 13%. And we are talking about January numbers. This conflict is not in January. Conflict only happened in February. And as far as the consumer price index, even that has gone above 6%, which is higher than the number that RBI targets. So I don't quite know what the Monetary Policy Committee will do. Perhaps at some point of time it will raise the repo rate. And
but there again, in terms of a medium-term angle, the higher the oil prices remain, there will be a repercussion for India's inflation, obviously, internally. So again, an interest in cutting this conflict, India's interest obviously would be in a quick resolution. What about the stock market, for example? We've seen a flight of capital over the last 6 months. Again, I think you'd say probably this is not caused by the Ukraine, but it's probably also a cause of concern that there will be lesser appetite of Western companies to invest in India?
You're right. As you mentioned, there has been some concern, not just in foreign circles, but also within India, about the sharp rise of our stock prices. As you may recall, just a month back, before the crisis, the Sensex was somewhere around 62,000. So now somewhere, so it has come down. It came down by almost 10%. Pardon me. So I think it's the Ukraine crisis is only further accentuating that concern, and it is coupled with something else, which is the fact that the U.S. Federal Reserve has already indicated in no uncertain terms that it will raise rates. Why? Because US inflation, which is usually quite low, has been registered at 6%. So if the Federal Reserve is raising its rates, not that we are in the same kind of vulnerable situation of 2013, the so-called taper tantrum, but when US raises interest rates, some FIIs, foreign institutional investors who have invested heavily in Indian government securities, as you know, there is a cap on how much they can invest in, they might think of going back to US government securities. And right now, the US 10-year bond is over 2%, which is very high compared to what it has been ever since 2008. And the German Bund, the German government 10-year bond, is somewhere around 0.35%. Not long ago, it was a negative territory. So even before this crisis, there has been a rollback of the easy money policies of the US and more generally of the G7 countries. So we are, all this is coming at a very bad time for
So
us.
let's go down the bad news road. There's more, which is sanctions.
Yes.
The sanctions have, by the US, by the European Union, by Japan and other powers, have made it more difficult for India to trade with Russia in dollars in particular, also in euros, and have therefore, I think, hit Indian companies. I think from reports I saw, there's now over $500 million due in payments for exports that have already left the Indian market to Russia, and the Russian importers being unable to process those payments. In fact, in I think second day of the invasion, the RBI put pretty much all transactions with Russia on hold. So tell us a bit about that, how that is affecting. I think trade volume with India and Russia is not significant, 8 to 10 billion, of which most is defense. But still, it is significant because it will make India's job much more difficult, again, in terms of its trade relationships.
You're right that India-Russia trade relations are going to be negatively impacted. But as you mentioned towards the end of your question, the total two-way trade between India and Russia is 1.2% of India's trade with the rest of the world. So to that extent, it is not something which will impact the country as a whole. Yes, individual importers and exporters are going to be badly hit because for them, it's difficult if they have borrowed to be able to export to Russia, and now there are issues in terms of the banking channels through which they can get their lines of credit and so on. But I would not see that as something which is that dramatic for the Indian economy as a whole. I think the government of India would be able to figure out something with in coordination with Russian authorities. And I don't think that would attract Western sanctions, also because it is relatively very small in volume. I think government would be able to figure a way out. I don't see that as a major issue in the short or the long term. What is of much greater concern to us as a result of this conflict in terms of economic consequence for India is what happens in terms of the currencies in which we transact business around the world. Do we need to try and diversify? As you know, that we too have reserves of over 600 billion. I'm not suggesting that we are in any situation in which any country whose currency we hold, and obviously these are convertible currencies, the majority of it is in US dollars, denominated in US dollars. Between China and Russia, they set up, between the two central banks, it was something that the Chinese set up in 2015 for bilateral settlement. And you may know this already, the Russians hold about 170 billion of their foreign exchange reserves in Chinese renminbi central government securities. So they've been trying to diversify. Now, what should India do in this kind of a situation, looking to 10 years from now, 20 years from now? So we should be thinking of acquiring equity in countries as which would be relatively liquid, because you acquire equity in mines and so on. Those are not liquid. So what kind of equity within inverted commas can you acquire which are relatively liquid and which would be somewhat impervious to sanctions? Of course, if the entire West is out to sanction some country, I'm assuming here there would not be any situation in the near or distant future that they want to sanction India, but they want to sanction a third country.
Has happened in the past,
as we know, in 1998.
But those days seem to be gone.
Yes, after our
nuclear.
When we had the nuclear test, there were sanctions, but they were relatively short-lived because of the discussions between Jaswant Singh and Strobe Talbot and so on. You know that very well, and Mr. Talbot has written a book about it. So yes, so I'm thinking that even if it is not direct, in this case it's not direct, the sanctions are not aimed against India, but we are facing the consequences. So how do we diversify and make ourselves less vulnerable? It's not an easy job, but you should be thinking about it too. For instance, on the energy front, we touched upon it briefly on oil, that we are so dependent on oil imports. Why is France not so? Since you referred to Europe, that I should also speak and focus on Europe. France, you don't hear of the same panic in France as in terms of, not panic, maybe an exaggeration,
concern, yes.
But concern in Germany about gas imports and Nord Stream 2 and so on. Why? Because France produces 78% of its power from nuclear reactors. And in fact, also exports power from nuclear reactors to Belgium, where I was, so I know it. And in Belgium, as you know, the highways are lighted up at night. So you are zipping along on 8-lane highways which are fully lit, and that is because of nuclear power. So you might say, what is the implication for India?
So we'll come to that. That's two very important points about it. We're already jumping the medium term now. Two very important suggestions for India to navigate future crises and future weaponizations of interdependence, which is really what we're noticing. But just if I may hold on you just a short term still on these sanctions. The US has taken a very strong position. The Europeans have taken a strong but not a total position. As you rightly mentioned, the EU has exempted, because of its gas dependence, especially Germany, France of course not, you mentioned, but Germany and towards Central and Eastern European parts, has exempted Russian banks in the energy sector from its sanctions precisely for that dependence. But for India in that sense, whether it's oil, defense, trade, what would be the options? You mentioned walkarounds, ruble, rupee arrangement. What does that mean? If you could explain us a little what those bypasses.
As I mentioned, even for oil, we get very little oil. As I said, we only import less than $1 billion worth of oil from Russia.
But for those 10 billion, I mean, India trades 100 billion with EU, 100 with the US. This is a tenth of that, but still it's 1 to 2%. How can you maintain a decent trade relationship with Russia if that's the objective?
It's going to be very difficult in this immediate aftermath of the sanctions that have been imposed. Let me give you an example of China. There are many Chinese companies which have their footprint in Europe. For instance, Volvo. You might think that Volvo, since it is still based in Sweden, is Swedish. No, it is 100% owned by some Chinese company. 100% of hugely enormous fraction of its equities. TikTok, you think it's located in Singapore, but it's basically Chinese owned. And my sense is that Chinese companies are going to be encouraged or allowed by the Chinese government to take the line that, we are independent companies. Chinese government might say or do something, but as companies, we are responsible to our shareholders. And since our first and last responsibility is to our shareholders, if there are Western sanctions, as a result of which our company might be affected, so then we have to observe those sanctions. Similarly, for Indian companies, whether they are private sector or government, they should, I think, in their own interest, not try to circumvent Western sanctions. They should look for the government to figure out some way in which they can be assisted. Given the fact that the volumes are not so high, my sense is that the government would be able to find a way out for those exporters or importers, more exporters, because the Russians have to pay and their normal channels of payment are blocked. SWIFT, for instance, and so on. So that makes it a little difficult. But this is, Russians have been discriminated for some time. I remember, just as a personal anecdote, the Russian ambassador to the UK used to live in the same street as me when I was based in London. And I remember chatting with him once, and I'm now talking about 2013, which is almost 9 years ago. And he said that his staff and his officers find it very difficult to open an account because all kinds of questions are asked by the bank, I'm sure at the behest of UK government authorities. And it's not as if they can just not open an account, but it takes them a long time. And he says, just crediting their salary into their account becomes a problem. And sometimes we have to, the embassy itself has to draw money and then distribute in cash to the officers concerned till such time as they can have accounts. So there has been this concern about Russia for a long time. Now it has come to the surface in a very dramatic manner because they have gone and invaded Ukraine and plunged this knife into their economic heart.
In fact, on the bypasses or the ways you can get around Western, US and EU sanctions, which are really the main actors in the world of sanctions, there is a precedent of Iran, where Iran was hit hard with USD and Euro sanctions, where India found very innovative and original ways to keep trading with Iran, and oil in particular, much more important, that relationship. So that's good to hear that there are solutions there, and that of course that's something, though, that in your view has to be invested in more because these crises will be recurrent. One last aspect on also the effects of India. Of those $9 billion worth of trade, around 8 to 10 with Russia, most of it is defense, in the defense sector. There's been a lot.
I beg your pardon. No, that's not defense. Defense is separate. This is
just non-defense?
This is non-defense.
Okay.
And you will get these numbers in the Ministry of Commerce website. And in fact, they will list for you in detail each item of export and each item of export. So there is no...
So if 8 to 10 billions are non-defense, then the defense one will be even
defense
more
is very
significant.
lumpy. It doesn't happen
when
on
there's
a particular
specific
year. It's very lumpy. Suddenly, you'd have many billions, and then that is paid over a period of time. And it is not as easily, that information is not so easy to get from published sources naturally, because governments have no great...
It is India's most important defense partner. 80 to 85%, 60 to 80%, depending on the calculations, of India's weapon systems and all its technological co-development. We saw the BrahMos missile being exported to the Philippines now. It's a major Indian defense export, a system that was developed with Russia. But this will affect, of course, India. And we saw also the army chief recently, after the invasion, mentioning that there is a need for self-reliance. This has been, I think, one of the priorities of this government over the last few years, to create an indigenous defense industry and economic defense sector in India. Do you see this as a possible, a way for India to start looking at alternatives beyond Russia? Not the US, which has also been, of course, an important part, not only the US or France, which is an important defense partner, the UK, some Scandinavian countries, but Japan also, and other economies that want to somehow not support with ready-made systems, but want to see this maybe as a chance to invest in the Indian economy, technology, research towards defense indigenization priorities.
You're very right. And this is yet another wake-up call. That we need to be somewhat more self-reliant and diversify our sources as far as defense equipment is concerned. But in recent times, as you know, our acquisitions from the US have gone up. But the US has all manner of legislation. So you need to either carve out exceptions or the legislation itself has to be changed to allow exports to a country like India. And we won't get into details of that right now. But as you know, there was international competition for the fighter aircraft, and France got the deal. The Rafale deal, as you know, quite some time back, it led to a major controversy in terms of kickbacks, was Bofors guns from Sweden. So it's not as if we have not imported from others, but your basic thrust of your question is right, that the substantive number of defense acquisitions from the Soviet Union earlier and Russia later outweighs those from other countries. But there is an element here which one needs to mention, which is that sophisticated technology, for instance, nuclear-powered submarines, not available from any other country. It's not like fighter aircraft. So Russia has been more willing, and before that Soviet Union, to share sensitive technology and the equipment in which it is housed and than the Western countries. So to that extent, the West has taken a view that we will either not be in a position to export item X or Y, or give you a black box in the sense that there is no transfer of technology in any way. The Soviets earlier and then the Russians have been somewhat more prepared. I wouldn't say that this is like 0 and 100. Somewhat more prepared to share technology. And we, by definition, have been keen to try and acquire the technology so that at some point of time in the future, we should be able to produce our own defense equipment for the three wings. And as you know, HAL has been for a long time trying to do more in terms of fighter aircraft. And here, I think it's a lot of the blame India has to take for the kind of position it finds itself in, that it has not been able to adopt, adjust, and bring in the private sector to the extent it should have much earlier. There has been this, do everything in government or in a government public sector undertaking, a PSU. Now, yes, there is no reason to believe that a PSU should be incapable of doing what a private sector company can do. But as we know from our experience around the world, that profit motivation and the kind of shareholder pressure that a private sector company like L&T, which as you know is now getting into a number of areas of defense production, should have come perhaps earlier, but better late than never. So this situation, which has been caused by the invasion of Ukraine, among other things on the economic side, should also be a wake-up call on the defense production side, that we need to do much, much more with the private sector within the country and try and indigenize so that we are not, I hesitate to use the word, but I guess not held to ransom in a situation where our defense preparedness is shortcomings on our defense preparedness is because in a crisis situation like this, we just can't get the spare parts or whatever it is, ammunition, high altitude boots, whatever it is.
And supposedly now AK-47s from Russia that have been delayed because of the crisis, and maybe maybe required if things flare up in the Himalayas again with China. But Dr. Bhagwati, I want to use this term you've used, wake-up call. Very interesting to sort of what this crisis really means tectonically, right? I mean, we talked about immediate economic impact. We talked about energy, financial instruments and architecture changing with currencies, the defense sector in India as a wake-up call. Before we do that and go into this wake-up call towards the unknown unknowns or known unknowns, which you'll help us to understand, I'd be very keen to get your take on one particular puzzle that I think many of us, observe from the outside, is that governments say something in public and they act in different ways or do different things in the background. That is, for me as a realist, not surprising, but it's sometimes a bit puzzling for people. And I say this because a lot of people have been asking to what extent there is really a deep disappointment by the West with India, particularly India abstaining at the United Nations Security Council, United Nations General Assembly votes, an India that is supposedly sitting on the fence, that can't be relied on, and that therefore, reading into those statements, etc., will lead to worsening of relations with India, between the EU and India, the US and India. There's been a lot of comments and discussions and debates on this. And on the other hand, we could see also that sometimes governments say things in public, but then in the end sort of reassure each other and say, we're going to keep working. But in a situation where this is such a politically salient issue in Europe, right, it's very difficult probably for a European government to say, we're fine with India abstaining. But if you could help us understand whether you think this will derail US-India, EU-India relations, Japan-India relations also, or if there is a certain understanding between these states and maybe an agreement to disagree.
I think the last expression that you used, agree to disagree, and there is a certain amount of tolerance of India because, sometimes people are a little more tolerant of the weak and I'm sure some people will object to my saying that India is weak. But if you look at our per capita income, even in PPP terms, and if you look at how we are organized in our cities and the pollution in Delhi during winter, the average ambassador here knows that not everything we do is because we have a certain motivation to behave in a manner which is counter to Western interests. A lot of our dependencies and sometimes what we are coerced to do is because of economic necessities. So right now, denouncing Russia, given certain dependencies that we have allowed them to persist, means that we have to be a little careful. But I think we have already made it quite clear in the statements of our permanent representative at the UN, in the explanation of our vote, that we are, of course, not at all comfortable with the loss of life and so on. And we have requested all parties to desist from any kind of armed confrontation. Now, is this sufficient for the West? I don't know. I have a feeling that while they may be uncomfortable, the true test of how uncomfortable they are is if they start trying to impose sanctions on India. As of now, there are no direct sanctions on India. It's only in case you violate some sanction which is aimed and directed against Russia, and you are trying to circumvent and help Russia to overcome. And in fact, China is in a more difficult situation there, because that country has the size of economy and the ability to help Russia in ways which we just can't, not given the size of our relationship with Russia or the size of our economy. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. What I would be more concerned about is our longer term economic relationship has to be with those countries which are at cutting edges of technology and so on. And Russia, to some extent, I think this invasion is driven by the fact that Mr. Putin has not been able to cater to the needs of the middle class. I'm sure you know that Russia's GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms is about, I think, 50% of that of Germany. Of Poland, which is an EU member, it's about 75%. I'm now talking about GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, and Ukraine is 29%. Now, the average Russian who is very well educated and is capable of being a superb engineer, as good as the best who work with Mercedes or any such company in West Europe, must be wondering, why am I not at that same level? And Mr. Putin's this adventure, as I would like to call it, misadventure, is perhaps driven by the fact that he cannot meet the aspirations of those classes of people in Russia who are looking to move up. And the same thing would apply to India, to any government, if you cannot meet those rising aspirations. So that is what is really required. We are, of course, at a lower level than Russia in every way, in per capita terms and otherwise. But we need to be more concerned about that. And there I feel the West will want to have a partnership with us, because wherever you have goods that have to be mass produced and still require human intervention, as you know, we're starting to talk about tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and the decades ahead, we will gradually move to more and more of factories and other such places where you'll have far more automation. So we don't want to miss the bus there. We need to provide a place for Western companies to manufacture in India, but for the world, which is what China has done. But now others like Vietnam, etc., are taking over, and in garments, Bangladesh outstrips us. So those are the real challenges, and I think you will get Western sympathy, or if not sympathy, understanding of where India is trying to go. I mean, no democracy is perfect. We saw what happened in the US during the Trump years. So there will be some understanding and sympathy for a country like India at our per capita income levels, that we have to be very mindful of not creating situations in which there are riots for one reason or the other related to economic scarcities.
So the best foreign policy is economic growth. It's good economic development and growth at home, at least is the necessary condition. We have another 4 minutes, 5 minutes maybe, and let's end on the future. I think that you can help us understand a bit on what this means, what India's options would be to strengthen itself and strengthen its response and its capacity to address future such crises, or what the takeaway lessons could be, let's say, from your perspective from this crisis, in particular on the financial architecture, on technology, self-reliance, supply chains. In future, what would your 2 or 3 takeaways of this crisis for India to reforms in its institutional architecture, in its policies, in its diversification strategy? On defense, we talked on Russia, for example, but on any sector that you deem to be critical.
I would think that the biggest lesson for us out of this crisis is energy. Energy is what has been an issue on which West Europe and Russia have been closer, maybe not on the same page, but closer, particularly Germany, than the US with Russia. We are an energy a country which depends on imports of fossil fuels. I would project that France is the model. You remember the 123 agreement? Nothing much came out of it in terms of a number of foreign operators wanting to set up nuclear.
This is the nuclear agreement between the US and India that normalized India's nuclear status.
The NSG gave its approval, and we can import uranium for those reactors which are under safeguards, etc., not for military purposes. For that, we have to depend on indigenous sources of radioactive material. But coming back to energy broadly defined, we should depend. I mean, others may disagree, because some people have a kind of aversion to nuclear energy because they worry about storage and disposal of nuclear waste. But France is a great example of how they have been able to keep environmental side effects or negative effects on the environment by going full stream ahead on nuclear power. But nuclear power, I remember I was in the Department of Atomic Energy in 1986 and 87, and Dr. Rajaramanna was chairman, and later on Dr. M.R. Srinivasan was chairman. And the slogan at that time was 10,000 megawatts by year 2000. We are today at 7,000 megawatts, 2 decades after the year 2000, into the 21st century. Now, I'm not finding fault with the Department of Atomic Energy. They have multiple constraints. There might be funding, etc. As you know, there is a linkage with Russia. As you know, as far as the Kudankulam plants are concerned, I think 4 are on the anvil and 2 more are being proposed. But I come here to our own indigenous effort, which is the fast breeder reactor at Kalpakkam. I've been hearing about the fast breeder reactor for a long time. Again, without any blame for anyone, I believe some kind of a prototype fast breeder reactor should come online in 2022 or 2023. So those are the things that the top leadership of this country, wherever they are, should be looking at to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, both because of the fact that we don't have enough of them, and also from the environmental side. As I said, I have to be careful here because certain environmentalists, like in Germany, as you know, Chancellor Merkel decided to after the Fukushima incident in Japan, decided to go slow on nuclear power, in fact, stopped production of nuclear power. The other aspect, which nobody will disagree with, is green energy, which is you move to renewable sources of energy. And there India should also try, because we have fantastic mines in our country. You might have heard of green hydrogen. Right now, when you split water, it's H2O, so 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 of oxygen. The amount of energy taken to split it is more than the energy that you will get by burning that hydrogen. And the hydrogen, when it burns, it comes out as steam. It's water, so there's no pollution. So, of course, some people who are far more knowledgeable about these things than me will say, oh, these are pipe dreams, it'll take another 30, 40 years. Well, the world will still be around 30, 40 years.
And the 1, 2, 3 deal you mentioned you said didn't lead to a big change, but has the potential to be...
Potential for India to collaborate with South Korean companies, with Westinghouse in the US or Japanese companies, to come here and set up. Why is it only Russia? I'll tell you what happened. 1998, when we had our nuclear tests, nobody wanted to collaborate with India. Nobody meaning the Western countries did not want to collaborate with us on nuclear power. And Russia used the fact that there was an agreement going back to 1989, which was before the Soviet Union had broken up, and used that to collaborate with us at Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu. But post the 1, 2, 3 agreement, anybody and everybody can come. I'm surprised that the Nuclear Power Corporation has not been able to move forward as much as it could. Maybe it's a question of finances, but I think it's also something to do with this very myopic, and what I would think a legislation which should be rolled back, which is the Nuclear Liability Act, which makes it very difficult for any supplier of equipment and anyone who collaborates with us to escape the consequences in terms of any accident for the huge liabilities. So they can't find any insurance companies to insure them against those liabilities. You remember the Bhopal gas tragedy, and a lot of the debate in the parliament at the time of the passing of the Nuclear Liability Act went back to the Bhopal gas tragedy and said that Union Carbide was able to get away without paying sufficient amounts by way of reparations. Looking back all the time is not very helpful. I think looking forward, how to make it possible to have a legislative environment in which countries can collaborate with us on the nuclear front, and I don't want to overdo this, but also on the renewable energy front, whether it is wind energy, whether it is tidal energy, whether it is any other...
The International Solar Alliance.
We need to be able to get our own solar panels. I know it's expensive. The Chinese, by comparison, China can produce them at a much lower cost. I don't think that these issues are beyond any solution. I don't know, so I must confess here, maybe government is already doing a lot, but I don't see enough of it in the public domain.
Dr. Bhagwati, thank you so much. I think this last point in particular is worrisome because a less energy-dependent India will have less need for foreign policy if you can be autonomous in that. But I think those are very important suggestions in terms of the long-term agenda for the country and the takeaways from this crisis in the Ukraine in particular, which seems very distant, but as we, I think, learned from you here over the last 40 minutes, has deep, immediate and long-term consequences that must be further studied and researched, including hopefully here also with you at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Thank you, Dr. Bhagwati, and hope to talk to you on another more peaceful occasion.
Thank you. Thank you, Constantino.
Thanks.
Nice talking to you.